What you hear today, you tithe on money. Well, the original tithe was never on money. It was always on produce of the land and the animals. So that's something we have to think about when we start studying this. And I don't think the preacher would want to bring in a couple of sheep or goat to the church. But that's just a minor point in a way, because when you study into this, you'll find out it's a very complex subject. There was not only one tithe in Israel, there was multiple tithes. Two of them very easy to prove. The third tithe is kind of iffy. The scholars seem to disagree on it. If it was maybe just a different use, the second tithe, if you're not familiar with that, the first tithe, of course, was given to the Levites. And then, of course, you had the festival tithe, which we call, some of us came out of a church that actually tried to practice some of this. So we had what we call a festival tithe or a second tithe. And then there was a third tithe that was given to support the widows and orphans, and in the original scripture, of course, the Levites. So anyway, we'll go into it and we'll start on it today and see how we go. If you will, turn to Leviticus 27, verse 30. And I'm not going to read all these. I'm just going to read the part of the verse, I guess you say the key part of the verse. If you're going to follow along. 27. Chapter 27, verse 30. It says, the tithe of the land, of the seed of the land, or of the fruit of the tree. So of course, they were agriculture type people. We understand that. That's the way they basically made their living. They did have craftsmen, of course, that made different things. And we know Christ following his dad's footsteps as a carpenter, working with wood and stuff. So that was very common to have other crafts or trades. But the unique thing about the tithing law, it didn't include those. It only included people, you might say landowners, the one that actually produced stuff on their land or raised cattle. I'm going to use the word for cattle because they use the word sheep, oxen, goats, all that. So you kind of know what I'm talking about. The next one is Deuteronomy 14:23. And this one's referring to what we call the festival tithe, or the feast tithe, or the second tithe. It said, you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And so that was the purpose of this festival, to learn to fear God. Now, we'll continue on. The next one was, Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 12. I'm just covering some of the basic parts of this. When you have finished paying all the tithes of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, then you shall give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, to the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. And the third tithe is the one that's kind of questionable. It's highly debated. I tried to read several commentaries on this, and the more I read, the more I got confused. We thought we had it worked out worldwide, which many of us came out of, but I'm not so sure now we did, because we had other stuff wrong, so we probably had this wrong. Then in Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 37, it says, we will also bring the first of our dough. That doesn't mean money. We use that word today as a slang term, our dough. Our contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, the oil, to the priest at the chambers of the house of our God, and the tithe of our ground to the Levites. For the Levites are they who receive the tithes in all the rural towns. Then in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 5, and the tithe of the grain, the wine, the oil. I'm just showing you here, prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions to the priest. And then the most abused verse about tithing, Malachi 3, verse 10. That one's, if you're a tithing preacher, whatever, that's one of your key verses right there. Because if you don't do this, you're going to be cursed. So we don't want to be cursed, so therefore, will a man rob God? And when I first read it, I thought, well, I don't rob God. That'd be the worst thing I could do, is rob God. But as you study and realize later on, your eyes are open to this, you realize this is not referring to Christians today. And if you read in chapter 4 then, In verse 4, it talks about, remember the law of Moses. This whole chapter is about correcting, the first part about correcting the priests for not doing their duties and not paying taking care of the tithe properly. So if you read through the whole chapter, all the chapters of Malachi, you can see this is what this is really addressing here. It's not addressing that you're going to be cursed because you do or don't do something. Because Jesus said it rained on the just and the unjust, I think in the King James. So your blessings from God are not dependent upon you tithing. Now, before I go any further, I do want to add, we're going to cover Christian giving later. This is not anti-giving. This is anti-tithing. Tithing is not as I tell people, it's a biblical subject or biblical thing. It's biblical, but it's not Christian. There's two different things here involved. Remember, we're under what? The new covenant. We don't try to keep the parts of the law to become justified with God. Now, I asked the question, how many times of all these verses I read did you notice money? Never mentioned. Now, the people say, well, they didn't have money then. Wrong. Go back to Genesis, and let's see, in the King James Version, money, the word money, appears 32 times. In the New American Standard, it's 28 times. So they had money. It wasn't a matter they didn't have money. People say, oh, they didn't have money then, so they had to tithe off the animals. No, they had money. Examples of this. Genesis 17:12. Okay, you want to read that? These are just some examples that proves or shows that money existed pre-law. But before Moses, the law was given about, 430 years after Abraham, somewhere in that neighborhood.
And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money.
Bought with money, yeah.
From any foreigner who is not of your descendants.
In Betty Jean, you want to read, there's a person or a servant being bought. Genesis chapter 33, verse 19. Genesis chapter 33, verse 19.
33.
Uh-huh.
He bought the piece of land when he had pitched his tent from the hands of the sons of I can't pronounce these words. For 100 pieces of money.
Money. See, there's money again, using it to purchase land. And then, Brian, Genesis chapter 42, verse 27. Genesis chapter 42, verse 27.
As one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack.
So here we have money. Again, in this case, buying grain or whatever it was, wheat. Then in Genesis 47:15, Kim, if you'd like to read that, this is what
And
happened.
when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us your food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone."
They went broke here in the family. So you can see that money did exist. It wasn't a matter of they didn't have money to tithe on, because that's one of the objections that people will throw back at you. Say, well, they couldn't tithe off money. Yeah, money was there. Another one that's used a lot to endorse tithing is Matthew 23:23. And actually in this verse, Jesus does endorse tithing. If you read it, he does endorse tithing. But I like to read it from the New Living Translation. It makes it very clear. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb garden, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law. Shows you part of the law right there. Justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important thing. Now, instead of Jesus turning around and say, boy, you guys are doing a great job because you're just so meticulous, you tithe all your little herbs out there in the garden. He's pointed out to them they were doing what? Ignoring the more important aspects of the law. So that right there shows you it's part of the law. He agrees, and he actually agrees that you should tithe. But what period of time were they living? They were still living under the old covenant. See, that's the thing. You got to know where you are in time and space here. Which covenant we're living under? We're living on the new covenant. We're not living on the old covenant. We're not living on the law of Moses. Therefore, we're not obligated to tithe. Now, you can tithe if you want to. That's up to you. That's between you and God. But there's no set percentage in the New Testament. And we'll go through that when we get into the giving part. And people say, well, but we need to follow what Jesus did. And we did that because we kept the Sabbath. Jesus kept the Sabbath. I did it for 22 years or something like that. And some of you did. Because Jesus did it. But do we do everything that Jesus said? Should we do everything that Jesus said? Because if you turn to Matthew chapter 8, verse 3 and 4, and say if you want to read that. Matthew chapter 8, verse 3 and 4.
Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest, and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.
How many of you have been to the priest lately? You see what I'm saying? We're living in a different time era, a different covenant. And it's easy to get them mixed up. It really is. And we had it mixed up for many, many years. And we were sincere, but sincerity is not necessarily a substitute for truth. But we were sincere. I think the people that paid their 3 tithes are pretty sincere people. One way to test somebody's sincerity is they get in their pocketbook. That tests their sincerity real fast. So we were wrong, but we were sincere. If they still want to argue, say, well, all this is really part of, when we get right down to it, the law of tithing, Sabbath keeping, holy day keeping, annual Sabbath, new moons, festival of new moons. All this is part of the law of Moses. And we have learned from Paul that you're going to be cursed if you don't do everything in the law. You know, when Israel was given the law, what did they say? We'll do part of it, God said, all you have said, we'll do it. All you have said, we will do. So we can't just pick and choose. We like this, we don't like that. One verse to me that really makes it clear. Let's look at Deuteronomy 12:6. And Dick, you want to read that? Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 6. This to me is a good verse to remember where tithing is located. In addition, a lot of other stuff.
12:6.
Mm-hmm.
And thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings, and your sacrifices, and your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, and your vows, and your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds, and of your flocks. Okay, if I didn't miscount, there's 7 different categories, or what do you want to call it there. Tithes happens to look like to be the 3rd one there. Now, why can we reach in and grab tithing, take out tithing, but not take out burnt offerings, or vice versa? See, you're breaking the Scripture. Christ said the Scripture cannot be broken, but you're breaking the Scripture when you reach in. It's just like Colossians 2:16, where people go in, they say, well, we do the weekly Sabbath, but we won't do the annual festivals or the new moons. You know, you can't just take one verse and say, I like this part, but I dislike this part. You throw that away. And we were guilty of it. We threw away the new moons.
I wondered about it occasionally, but I thought, well, they understand, I don't. But I see now that it's a package deal. That's the way I think of it. The old covenant's a package deal, the new covenant package deal. We either take the old or the new. Under the old, I don't think none of us want the penalties of the law of Moses in our life. We want the mercy of God. That's what you get in the new covenant. Now, you do still have obedience. Just because you don't do a lot of the stuff of the old covenant doesn't mean that you don't obey the teachings of Christ in a lot of areas. But when it's obvious that it's part of the law, that's the part you don't obey, like the Sabbath and things of that nature. And yes, he kept the Sabbath, and of course the Apostle Paul kept the Sabbath. I can give you the arguments on both sides of this issue. But did you ever notice how many times Paul taught Gentile churches to keep the Sabbath? Not there. Remember, he was the apostle to the Gentiles. And surely, if they didn't know anything about it and they were supposed to keep it, it would have been his responsibility to teach them, but he didn't. Okay, just want to bring that out. Another makes it very clear, and this is in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 5. Let me get back to UK.
And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest's office have commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham.
Okay, so there you have a tenth from the people, a commandment in the law. So you don't even have to go back and read the Old Testament. You can just read it right here. We had an individual that showed up in our Bible study years ago when we were having public Bible studies, and his argument was we don't need to know anything about the Old Testament. I think you do, but when Jesus said, remember Lot's wife, who's Lot's wife if they hadn't read the Old Testament? He refers back to a lot of things. We know Sodom and Gomorrah is mentioned in the New Testament. So there's historical facts mentioned in the New Testament. And one person I know, she said, well, nobody should be interested in history. History is not really that important. I believe right now the New Testament's history. Written a long time ago. Still history. The Old Testament's even further back. So history is important. To me it is. So we know that Paul warns about this picking and choosing stuff. And in Galatians chapter 3, verse 10, Betty Jean. GEPC.
I know that part.
That's all I can remember.
Georgia Electric Power Company.
Well, I had it memorized as GEPC. But I like that. Power company, I like that.
Was it 310?
Yeah.
310.
I hope it's correct.
Yeah. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them.
Cursed is everyone who does not abide or do or practice all things written in the book of the law. That's pretty strong language. This is the Apostle Paul writing this, and he's telling us, and this is what was happening in the Galatian church. They wanted to go back to the law of Moses. They wanted to be circumcised, and you pick one part, you got to do it all. And he just uses that as an example. Let's see, Brian, you want to read James chapter 2, verse 10? It's the same thought, just expressed in different words.
For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter, you just do part of it and think you're being made right with God. Doing part of it didn't make you right with God. Because doing the law didn't make you. You cannot be justified by the law of Moses. That's written in the scripture. You have to get established in your mind that that old covenant is really done away with. And that's hard because I guess we all have certain little things we like to cling to in that old covenant. I do. I mean, it's hard to give it up. You know, I like that one. I like that verse. But we have to forget that and go on. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, Kim. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13.
Yes. 13.
In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away.
Ready to vanish away. And even it hadn't vanished away at that particular time, it was going to vanish away. We know the temple was destroyed about 70 AD. My understanding is they were still practicing some of the old covenant laws. Even, I think it was Peter, James, and John who went the hour to pray at the temple, the hour of prayer. So they were still doing some of this. And no doubt, some of the people were still tithing that period of time. You have to keep in mind, these people had to be brought along just like we had to be brought along. I've often thought you have these little Jewish kids being taught from the time they're born about the law of Moses. Then here comes a new covenant. That's hard. How would you react? Put yourself in their shoes. You've been taught all your life to keep the Sabbath. Don't eat this pig over here. Don't eat that. Don't do that. Whatever the law is, and there's a zillion of them. There's actually, I think, 613 in the law of Moses. That's a lot to remember every day. Remember, you got to do them all. Because you stumble at one point, you've broken all the others. Most people think that's just the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the core, you might say, of the law. But then you have all these others. And the Bible plainly states that the Ten Commandments were part of the covenant. So you have to take that with it. And of course, I know when I say this, it's really dangerous because people say, oh, I can go do this, I can do that. I believe if you read the teachings of Christ, he pretty well covers all that. You know, you don't have to worry about, can I go kill somebody now? No. You hate them in your heart. Same thing. Can I go commit physical adultery now? No. You think it in your mind, you're guilty. He raised it to a spiritual level. Much higher plane. The bar, I say the bar is raised. First time I brought this up in Bible study, we had one particular person who really objected to it. Oh, you just letting people do everything? No. The standard is higher. You ever call anyone a fool? You're in danger of hellfire. That's pretty serious stuff. To me it is. And we have probably all done this at different periods of our life. We want to grow beyond that, but, you know, we can still lose our temper today. We can lose control.
Especially out on the interstate.
Oh, an interstate. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that. But
Or the internet.
we don't like that part. We don't like that part. Love your enemies. What does it say? Do good to those that what? Persecute you. Pray for them. Pray for your enemies. That's another very tough commandment of Christ. You know, the disciples said, you have some hard sayings. Some of those are hard sayings. They're hard to live by. We know them intellectually, but emotionally, like I said, violent interstate. You know, we're supposed to bring every thought into captivity. That's hard to do because we're still carnal. We're striving to go beyond that, but we'll never do it in this physical life because we're human beings. Okay, another text that's used, and we're going now to Genesis chapter 14, and this is where, you know, Lot gets captured. Abraham goes out with, I don't know, 300 men or something, I think it was, a little 300 men, and he recaptures it. and I think it was the 4 kings fighting each other. We won't go back and read the whole story, but anyway, on the way back, he meets this guy, Melchizedek, a priest of the Most High God. And he gives him a tenth of the spoils of war. You notice it wasn't income that he earned, it was stuff he captured. You go to Genesis 14, 18 through 20. Somebody can read that. Genesis 14, 8 through, let's see, where are we here? Back to, say, okay,
yeah,
okay.
so.
Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20.
And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all.
So he gave him a tenth of everything that he had captured. And then if you continue to read the story, you'll find out that the king offers him, say, well, go ahead and take this stuff. Take this booty, this spoils of war. And Abraham said, no, then you'll accuse me of making old Abraham rich. So he gave that back. The only thing that he took was it looked like basically the food of his, people went with him, whatever they consumed, I guess, his assistants, whatever you want to call them, servants, and that's all he took. And he returned the other. So he really didn't keep anything. He gave everything away. He gave the whole thing away, really, except, to say, operating expenses of his men, and so that was the thing that he did. And this is often, then from this, the conclusion is drawn, of course. See, Abraham tithed before the law. He did. One time. There's no other example of him giving a tenth or a tithe after that. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But from what I understand, there was a custom at that time that you would give with someone in honor, you gave them 10%. If you, anything. Now, I looked up some of this just to see. He says, in the International Standard Encyclopedia, it says, under the word tithe, in the ancient Near East, many ancient cultures practiced tithing in some form. Israel was merely one among many ancient Near Eastern peoples who tithed their property, produce, or currency. And the Egyptians, it said, practiced. The Syrians, I'm not sure how you pronounce this, Lydidians, I guess, Babylonians, and the Assyrians. And that's in volume 4, page 861. So it shows that tithing did exist, or tenthing, tenth or tithe, even in other cultures. Now, where he did that is a matter of just, as they say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Maybe he was doing that, I don't know. But it was not the biblical tithe in that sense, because the tithing law didn't exist. The tithing law came later, in the law of Moses, 430 years later. So we can't use that as a scripture to say Christians should tithe. And the reason for this is because, in Galatians 3:29 said, if you belong to Christ, you are now the seed of the descendants of Abraham. So therefore, since we're the descendants of Abraham, and since he practiced that, and he's our example, so to speak, we have to have the faith of Abraham, So therefore, we practice tithing. It's an easy conclusion to jump to, but it's a wrong conclusion because the law was given later. And what he may have been practicing there was maybe this culture thing. Just, people do certain things in their society, like we're not supposed to be the weirdos. If we can go along with something and it doesn't go contrary to our beliefs, we go along with it. But on the other hand, if it goes contrary to what we believe and adhere to in our life, we have to say, no, I'm out of this. And that's tough sometimes because, we've all been in what I call gray areas. Do I do this? I don't do that. Everybody else is doing it. And you have to sometimes draw the line in the sand, so to speak.
You're trying not to offend.
You're trying not to offend people. Our job is not to offend people. Our job is really to help them to come to know God. that's our purpose, without trying to offend them. Now, it may offend them. We were listening to a program last night, and some of the questions they were asking, it was one on that Sean Finnegan's website, and the questions they were asking, like, have you ever lied? And I said, yeah, I've lied. Have you ever stolen anything? Yeah. Well, so what do you call a person that tells a lie? An individual says, a liar. What do you call a person that steals something? Call them a thief. By their own admission, they admit it, see. And we've all done the same thing, because all humans have done basically the same thing. Maybe something not in one area, but other areas they have. In James, he talks about, I think, if you commit adultery, and then another one says if you kill somebody or something, where he talks about it doesn't matter which one you do, one's just as bad as the other. So we can't point the finger at somebody else and say, oh, but look what they did. You know, you may be doing 5 times worse. You know, if there's any way of measuring it. So it was an ancient culture. So I can't really use that as a proof text to say, well, we should tithe. And if you can't convince them with that, then you say, well, let's look at some of the other things that Abraham did. Since we're following his examples, we're going to follow the example of Abraham, right? He's our standard. Somebody read Genesis 22:13. Back to you, Vicky, I believe.
22.
13.
And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son.
Okay, there's an example of Abraham. Burnt offering. Okay. Genesis chapter 17, verse 12. Genesis 17, verse 12.
And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants.
Here we have another example of Abraham. Let's see, Betty Jean. Genesis chapter 25, verse 6. Genesis 25, verse 6.
But to the sons of his concubine Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east.
Okay, and then, well, we've already read this, but we know in Genesis 14:20, in Hebrews 7:4, he went out to battle, he captured these spoils of war, and then, of course, he paid a tenth or a tithe on that. Now, let's go to the New Testament and see if we can find something that agrees with this. Because remember, he's going to be our model, because he tithed, and after all, since he tithed, we're supposed to tithe. But, of course, the first thing is, I think most people agree that Christians do not offer animal sacrifices anymore. I mean, this elementary stuff, but we don't do it. Because 1 Corinthians 5:7, and Brian will read that, 1 Corinthians 5:7.
Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, also has been sacrificed.
Okay. Our Passover is Christ. And even right there, if you read that part where it says, therefore let's keep the feast or something else.
In 8.
Yeah, read that part.
Therefore let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth.
Catch that? Sincerity and truth. Not the old leaven, the old covenant. You know, when worldwide, the women used to scrub the walls down, supposedly. But it was a big deal to get rid of all the leaven out of your house. I mean, there were actually stories, I don't know if it's true, that circulated around the church that some women actually scrubbed the walls of their house. And, you know, each little piece of leaven, whether it be a bread crumb or a cracker crumb in your car, you know, you had to watch out for that. I mean, we were meticulous, but we were, you know, hypocrites or legalists, I guess it's like legalist is the best word.
Don't forget to empty the vacuum.
Yeah, and the vacuum bag, I forgot about it. And you cannot empty on your own property. So you empty on a neighbor's property, right? I mean, this is what, some of this is out there. I've done it, so I know what's out there. And I look back and I think, why do such foolish thing?
Well,
But we were blind.
because that little crumb represented a little bit of sin.
Yeah, a little bit of sin. Yeah, each crumb was sin. And you didn't get sin completely out of your life. You got every crumb out of your life. But did we work on the spiritual part of it that closely?
No.
We were too busy.
It was too busy.
Think about
Not the
spiritual.
Women were busy.
But you understand where I'm
Yeah.
coming from now. That we worked on this physical part. Physical stuff is easy. Keeping the Sabbath is much easier because you just refrain from working. And then we didn't do that correctly. 6 days shall you labor. You know, rest 1 day. So if you did labor 6 days, you only kept part of it. You were keeping the rest part, but you weren't keeping the laboring part. So there's a lot to it other than just looking at the overall saying, well, we should do this. And what opened my eyes, and I'm just throwing out this for other people that may help somebody, was when I first started learning a little bit about the Sabbath, and you don't have to keep the Sabbath. I'm kind of upset, you know. And he asked me a very good question. He says, when's the last time you stoned somebody for not keeping the Sabbath? I said, yes, I really haven't yet. But I mean, my eyes began to open. But this is what you get into. If you're going to have the law, you must have the penalty of the law. If you insist on the law, you must have the penalty of the law. And we didn't realize that. And we were kind of caught in between old and new covenants. And that's why we were kind of messed up. Because we didn't realize the new covenant was established. You know, Christ said, I pour out this blood, the new covenant, when he's talking to his disciples there. So we understand that now. We're living in a different era, a different time, under a different agreement, which is a better agreement. It says it's based on better promises. It's definitely a better covenant. He said it's a better covenant with better promises. What's the better promises? Eternal life. Israel was basically what? Promised physical wealth, prosperity. If you do this, I will do this. God said, if you do this, I'll do that. And of course, they blew it. They never really accomplished what God wanted them to. They just couldn't do it because they were carnal. And they didn't seek it by faith, as Scripture said. It's always been by faith. And faith, of course, is believing what God says, you know. And if they had believed what he said and had done it, they would, of course, had faith. And therefore, I guess, they would receive all those blessings. Because there's blessing chapters and cursing chapters in the Old Testament. You know, God names all the good stuff, and he turns around and says, okay, if you don't do it. Diseases and just all kind of stuff. I mean, the women would not be able to bear children, and just on and on and on. So there were two sides of the coin there. There's a good side and a bad side, so to speak. It's kind of like what happens at the end time. You have the bad, and then you have the good to come back in to replace it. So we need to keep that in mind when we're studying stuff like this. Somebody, let's see, we're back to King. Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, and then if you would flip over to the next chapter and read Galatians chapter 6, 15. I'll repeat it when you read the first one there.
For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love.
And then Galatians 6, 15.
For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation.
See, I'm trying to contrast the two between Abraham and what we do. Yeah, Abraham was a righteous man. You know, he was what called the father of the faithful, the friend of God. But we don't use everything he did as an example. You know, none of us have ever been asked to sacrifice our son. Not that we want to, but I'm saying we never have been asked to do that. So there's a lot of things that we have to weigh against the new covenant and see if it agrees or contradicts it. Let's see, we're back to Sarah. Let's see. This is Matthew 19:9.
say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery.
Okay, we know that if we go back to Genesis 25:6, this is where he had the concubines. And if you do a little bit of reading on that, they call it secondary wives. But I've often wondered, what does that word mean? I thought I knew what it meant, but they seem to, like, you're the second fiddle. You're the secondary wife. And we know that he had children by, was it Hagar? I believe it was. While he was still married to Sarah. Jesus didn't endorse that. You know, he said in the beginning it was not so. So we see here that doesn't agree with what the teachings of Christ. I think you can see the teachings of Christ are a lot higher standard. Okay, then we go to Matthew, 5:44, I guess be Vicky.
But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Mm-hmm. And what did Abraham do? He went to war. And I don't know if what he did, but he used force, let's put it that way, he had to capture this people. We're living under a different covenant. And a lot of times people will try to take old covenant. Listen to people. When bad things happen, they say, well, we ought to do such and such. Wait, is that the Christian viewpoint, though? Carnally, you may want to do it, but is it the Christian viewpoint? You know, when somebody slaps you, what's your first thought? That was wonderful. I can turn the other cheek now. In your own mind, you say, boy, I'd like to get even with him. You know, if you're thinking, and we all do that. We may not want to fight, but we want to get even. That's human nature. Human nature wants to get even. And I hear this all the time when people say, well, there's some terrible things going on in the war. We, you know, in this world, we need to do this. They go back and they grab an Old Testament scripture, which does support it under the Old Covenant. I think we all know that there's some things that I have trouble understanding, but God knew what he was doing when he told them to march in, kill women, children, animals, everything was moving, and he just was not going to have his people polluted. That's really hard for me to understand why he did that, but he did not want them to get intermingled with all this idolatry and all that. That's not our job today. We don't go out here and, kill people. That's not our job. Our job is to enlighten them, I guess, and help them to see that God is merciful to us, and we want that mercy. Oh, we always want the mercy, but boy, somebody else, we don't have that no mercy. It's only for us that we have to be careful about that. Because God wants all people to be saved, to come to knowledge of the truth. That's really his desire. Whether or not they will, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be from the scriptures that some people will still be cast in the lake of fire. And that's a terrible thing to think of. A terrible thing to think of. When people are completely gone forever. Okay, so the four differences between what Abraham did and what we see in the New Testament should help us see a little bit better why we're not obligated to do the same things Abraham did. That's not, to me, a valid argument that we should tithe because Abraham did such and such. Because why follow one example of Abraham with respect to that? And we know he's our spiritual father. You be in Christ, you're the children of Abraham, and therefore heirs of the promise. What was the promise? That he inherit the world, of course. So therefore, we do not have to do those things as a requirement. Now this is Genesis 14:20 is the only verse that mentions Abraham giving a tenth. And I keep going back, but it was not of his income. Earned income, as we would say. We used to say the word earned income. Well, back then it would be what was grown on the land your produce, your seed, and then your cattle that were produced on the land. And it had to be on the Holy Land, by the way. You couldn't tithe off of something that was maybe grown in a foreign land. It had to be in the Holy Land. It was set aside. So that's something that we didn't understand. And I know today in our society, we function with what? Money. So if you're going to give, you of course give money. I don't know if the website's able to take a goat yet for donations, but you get the point. Yeah, I realize we live in it because they say, oh, well, they didn't have money. They had money. But God did want them to, for some reason, God says he didn't worry about that because he knew they were agriculture-type people. They probably had very little money if they never had any money. They bartered a lot, I'm sure. There are all kind of ways you can do things. There's people today that still barter. They kind of function by doing that. You know, they trade somebody something and somebody else trade them. So you can function without money, and they did it basically as a society. Now, there's one tithe that was a festival tithe, and I think we get to that later. You could change into money. But most of them were what I'm going to call produce and animals. Okay, so that's, now another place, another verse used, say, well, how about Jacob? He gave a tenth to the Lord. He gave a tenth to God, and he did. Maybe. He said he would. I don't know. It doesn't say anywhere that he did, but if we believe that he was being upfront with God, he did. But Jacob was not known to have the most upright character. We know what he did. He took advantage of every opportunity he could to get advantage of somebody. He took advantage of his brother. He took advantage of his father-in-law. What's his father-in-law's name? Laban. Remember when he was down there? And, of course, Laban was not the most upright person either. He gave him the wrong woman. and then, of course, he has to work another, 7 years, I believe it was, to get the wife he really wanted. And he stayed there about 20 years, I understand. Anyway, let's read now what he did. It's in Genesis chapter 28. And let's see, about the K, if you will read Genesis 28, verses 20 through 22. I'll give you a lot to read here.
28, 20 through 22.
Yeah.
Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you.
What does this appear to like to you? If you'll do this, you'll be my God. If you do this, I'll give you a tenth. This kind of fits his character, doesn't it? He's going to make sure he comes out. He would make a good used car salesman, I guess. but you see, it's like, if you'll do this, then you'll be my God. How many of us ever made that bargain with God? If you do this, God, I'll give you a tenth. If you do this. What's so interesting is you back up a little bit. Can you read verse 15 while you're there? I hope you're still there.
Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.
Did he forget the promise? God had already promised, I'll be with you, I'll take care of you, I'll provide for you, and all this. Then he turns around and says, but if you do that, behold, I'm with you and keep you. So I don't really know why he did that. If he doubted God, anybody got any ideas on that?
Sounds kind of bold.
It sounds bold to me. If you'll do this, I'll do that.
I've heard a lot of people say, God, if you'll just get me out of this jam I'm in.
Right, I do, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of people that get in a jam and they promise a lot to God. Then when they get out of the jam, their
They
memory
forget,
kind of,
yeah.
their memory goes blank. It gets kind of scrambled. Okay, so we've covered the, I guess you say the biblical definition of the tithe and some of the original purposes of the tithe. Like I said, we're not going to get into a lot of the real details on some of it. But now we want to go and we want to look at how it was distributed, especially what I call the first tithe. So if you turn to Numbers 18, and I'm going to have to give all of you several verses, I guess, to get through this. It's Numbers 18, chapter, verse 20, I'm sorry, is where we want to start. Verse 20, 18:20. Back to Betty Jean. You'll read that one.
Then the Lord said to Aaron, You shall have no inheritance in this land, nor in any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the sons of Israel.
Okay, you notice here, Aaron and his sons, of course, did not really, well, as far as go, that the Levites didn't inherit anything. They had some cities. There were 48 cities that were given by the other tribes to them, but they didn't own anything. I'm gonna call the Levites, the priests, put it this way, they were the ones that did the religious ceremony. Then you had what I call the Levite workers, those that carried the tabernacle, put it up, the maintenance of the tabernacle. So you have, even though it's a tribe of Levi, you kind of got two different groups. You know, you've got what I'm gonna call the workers, you got the priesthood. And keep that in mind. You got the workers and the priesthood. Okay, 21 there, Brian.
To the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service which they perform, the service of the tent of meeting.
Okay, to the sons of Levi, say, I've given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service which they perform.
So they worked for us.
They worked for us, yeah. They were workers in the tabernacle. That was the maintenance workers, I'm going to call them. Tabernacle workers. That's one group of people. Okay, let's see, we're back to Kim. Verse 22.
So that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die.
Okay, we won't go a lot on to that. And the next thing is verse 23. Sarah?
Only the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the sons of Israel they shall have no inheritance.
Okay, you keep saying that they didn't inherit anything. They could use certain properties. If you read, they had these cities, and they had so much property extending outward they could farm and take care of their cattle and things. Because remember, the people were going to give them a lot of the whole tithe of Israel was going to the tribe of Levi. And so where do you think they kept all those animals? They didn't eat them all that fast. So they had to have some property, and the Bible talks about they had land, pasture land. Okay, let's go on now. Let's see. Verse 24, we're back to Vicki.
But the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as an heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance.
No inheritance. And then verse 25, Kay.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying,
I'm sorry, that's a short version. Jean 26.
Moreover, you shall speak to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the sons of Israel the tithe which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe.
A tithe of the tithe. Have you ever sat down and figured out how much really the priest himself actually received? Now you hear preachers talking about, the tithe should come to them. I don't think most of them would want to work for a tithe of a tithe. It figures out to be 1%. 1% of the total tithe. You've got these 11 tribes giving all this money to the tribe of Levi. That's a lot of tithe. That was given to the tribe of Levi. They in turn turned around and gave a tithe, the Levites themselves, what I'm going to call the workers, a tithe of a tithe to the priesthood. Now the priests really, that was just their small percentage. They had a lot of other stuff too. They were entitled to. But keep in mind, the priest did not serve year-round. There were courses or schedules, what you want to call it. I think there were 24 of them. So that would mean they'd serve out twice a year, maybe a week at a time. If you where's it, Matthew, where Zacharias? Yeah, Zacharias was in the course of, you might remember. Abijah, okay. Abijah. The course or the schedule. Then he went home. They went back to the farmlands. They went to this land. They didn't own it, but they could farm it. So therefore, they had property. They could grow stuff, and they had their cattle. Because remember, they're getting all this stuff constantly. And then they're turning around and giving, of course, a tithe of a tithe to the priesthood. Everything's coming from the other 11 tribes. So it's really important to understand there's, I say, two classes. I hate to say that. Two classes. You've got the working class and you've got the priesthood class. And they're both responsible for different things. You know, the priests were responsible for that, where the holy place was and all that. And what was it, Aaron, once a year, I believe, could go in. And you didn't dare go there. You were dead if you tried to go into this tabernacle. You recall, and even in the, we had the outer and the inner, and the Gentiles could not go into that inner sanctum in the New Testament. I understand they had signs posted around you. You go into here, you're dead. On the threat of death. So that's kind of you can see how that's related there. So you got two groups of people, I guess is the best way to say it. So we had the full tithe going, all the 11, remember the 12 tribes, you had 11 tribes given to the tribe of Levi. They called them Levites, I believe. Levitical priesthood, remember. The Levitical priesthood received about 1%, roughly, I can calculate, of the total tithe. A tithe of a tithe. You got a 10%, then you got a tenth of that. So you got the 1%. Because most people think that the preacher or the, whatever the group is, should get that. That's not true. If you're going to follow the old pattern. And they want to follow that pattern because that's how they get the money coming in. Because if I follow this Levitical priesthood, I can turn around Malachi 3:10 and I can really put a guilt trip on them. Will a man rob God? And then you're going to be cursed if you don't. But then Jesus says, well, it rains on the just and the unjust. The God the Father sends rain on the just and unjust. So your, I guess you say physical blessings, you want to call that, do not depend on tithing or not tithing. That's up to you. A person can tithe or not tithe. Then give 1% or you give 50%. You're not tied to a percentage in the New Testament. And that's very important to remember. Now, some people can give more than 10%. Some people can't give anything. You ever heard the law of gleaning? Remember when they would harvest the fields around the edges? What were they supposed to do? Go back and pick it up again? No, they left it for the poor, and they came in and they tithed. They gleaned from it. They gleaned from it. Remember when they knocked the fruit off the trees? You went over and hit the limb and knocked the apples or pears or whatever's falling off the tree. Don't go back over those limbs again. Leave that for the poor. You know, I think it's very interesting. We've talked a little bit about this, the difference between, and I'm all in favor of helping people. Don't get me wrong. But you notice these people that were poor people, let's say receiving aid, what did they have to do? They had to go harvest it themselves. They didn't sit at home and get a check in the mail.
Good point.
You ever notice that? We have a system, and I'm glad we live in the country, that helps to take care of older people. I am one of the older people. but most of us have paid in it all our life, so it's not like it's a gift, but we are very blessed in this country. But if you go back in the original idea of the tithe, it was, of course, for the Levites, and then we had, like we said earlier, tithe. It went partially to widows and orphans. We have today a kind of a safety net, if you want to call it, Social Security. Most older people today do have a certain degree of income. So they're not just completely destitute. But then people were. And we even get into the New Testament, we see that this is really what happens in the difference between the Old and New Covenant. You get into the New Covenant and you see we're still responsible, but in a different way. And now you do it out of compassion and love, rather than this law that says thou shalt give 10% or whatever. You do it out of real concern for people, and that's up to you. Some people can do more, and some people can do less. And God is not checking you off on a checklist. He missed his tithe this week. You know, you have to get over this feeling guilty, because people feel guilty. And people have gotten themselves in bad financial situations sometimes that could really not afford to give 3 tithes. I heard of a family, and I don't know if it's true, you hear a lot of rumors, that ate 1 meal a day to pay 3rd tithe in their family. The scriptures say if you don't take care of your own household, you're worse than infidel. You become worse than an unbeliever. Your family comes first in that sense. But a lot of people teach, I don't care what it is, you take your first part and you give it to God, you get to God's work, whatever, and they say, then if you got something left, you can pay your heat bill, your power bill, or whatever. That's right backwards in what the New Covenant's all about. The New Covenant is about loving other people and helping them, and not coming up with these do's and don'ts, and making people feel guilty because they can't give maybe the 10%. And that happens. It happens. I'm sorry.
Just a couple of questions.
Okay.
Is there ever any punishment as such for not tithing in Torah?
Tithing what?
Is there any punishment that comes with not tithing according to Torah?
Not that I know of, except the fact you would be cursed, remember.
Well, it sounds like
Yeah,
a punishment.
Yeah, right.
That's pretty bad. Yeah.
I mean, because Malachi, the whole book of Malachi is about this. But Malachi 3:10 is their favorite verse. Because you can really make people, I think the previous verse says, you're all cursed. Why am I cursed? Because you're robbing God. Will man rob God? Well, boy, that's it said, when I heard that, I thought, boy, I don't want to rob God. I'd rather rob a bank, rob God. I mean, how about you? But, you think I'm going to steal from God?
So you're saying the prophet Malachi says that there's a loss of blessings, but the Torah itself, God didn't say if you don't tithe,
right,
this is what I'm going to do.
Of course, in the old covenant, and when they were basically, God talks about opening the windows there and pour out a blessing for you. That's the verse it's quoted. I think it's verse 8 or somewhere along that. Anyway, he would pour out a blessing. Well, you go back in the other verses, you can find where he opened the windows of heaven and let the rains fall. So he would cut the rains off, see. They would not get the rain in due season, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, they'd be cursed because they were living off the land. If you can't grow your corn, you can't eat. So,
another question. Is it true that post-Gospels, apart from the four Gospels, that not even the word tithing or tithe is mentioned? And if so, where can we go as Christians to point to explicitly overturning tithing?
The only place it appears is in Hebrews chapter 7. And if you go there, let's go there, and you can read where he's comparing the old Levitical priesthood to the new priesthood and how much superior. And it does talk about tithing there, but that was one of the verses we read earlier. Remember about In the law, they have a commandment in the law to take a tithe. If I can find Hebrews, I know it's in here somewhere. Let's see. But that's a good question because, let's see here. What do we read about it? Verse 8. Okay, in this case, let's go to, let's see, verse 4. Now observe how great this man was to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the choice spoil. So he gave us, but notice it wasn't his income. He didn't earn it. I don't say he stole it, but he captured it, okay? And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest office has commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people or tithe, that is, from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. Then we go down, let's see, it's mentioned 2 or 3 times here in this chapter.
Is it verse 9?
Yes, and verse 9, and, so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithe, for he was still the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. And then it says, now, if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, on the basis if the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest, which of course is Christ, according to the order of Melchizedek, and be designated according to the order of Aaron? It says, well, when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes the place of the change of law also. Tithing was part of the Levitical law because it had to support the priesthood. We don't have a physical priesthood today. We have a spiritual priesthood. Christ is our, he says he's our high priest. So we have a spiritual priesthood in that sense. Do you know your priest? It says, I think you said you're a nation of priests, in Peter somewhere, I believe, a royal nation, priesthood. So in a sense, all believers are priests today. So
we tithe to each other.
we tithe to each other. You pay yourself a tithe. But you only get 1%, I remember. Okay. I thought that question would probably come up. Okay, then I'm going to cover that in a minute if we ever get there. We may not make it today. Okay, we've gone through how it was actually kind of distributed to the Levitical priesthood, the workers, and the priesthood. So we know they were getting it all. Now, other things that I won't have you turn there because we probably don't have time, but here's some of the other benefits, I guess you would say, that the actual priest received. This is found, of course, in Numbers 18. Every grain offering, every sin offering, and every guilt offering. So all these different sacrifices that were brought, they could eat there at the temple. Wave offerings, fresh oil, all the best of the fresh wine, the grain, the first fruits. A lot of people confuse first fruits and tithe. They're two different things. There's a verse that said they brought their first fruits in a basket to the priest. So it was a small amount. You recall they had the wave sheaf offering, where you would cut that and offer it as the first fruits to God. So the first fruits was not some big massive amount of money or produce. It was a token part of it. But they were entitled all this. The first ripe fruits of all their land. Then it says the first issue of the womb of all flesh, whether man or animal. And of course they had to be redeemed. Man had to be redeemed, bought back. And then the firstborn of the man you shall redeem. And the firstborn unclean animals. Remember, the unclean animals were not sacrificed, so you had to buy them back, redeem them back. But they left the clean animals because that was the ones they used for sacrifices. So we had it says the firstborn of oxen, sheep, and goat could not be redeemed because they're going to be used in sacrifices. But the pigs and whatever the other was, the unclean animals. I don't know if if you're not familiar with, there were clean, unclean foods or meats in the law of Moses. Mm-hmm. And many of us adhere to those, and that's up to the individual because Romans 14, I believe it is, addresses this problem. Some people have trouble with certain foods or drink or days. And we're not to condemn each other. But you know, we had this thing, are you keeping the Sabbath yet? You know, that was kind of like the key question, you know. Because right away, what? That makes you a Christian. You keeping the Sabbath? I'm going.
Sir.
Yeah.
Do you know if the early so-called church fathers were for or against the practice?
They were against everything I can read up to a certain period of time. There were many years. It was not really, I want to say, about 500 or 600 A.D. I can't remember. Just reading on that. But we do know, going back to the book of Acts, and that's what I wanted to bring out because we're about to run out of time anyway on that, about what somebody asked that question about, let's see. I had some facts just listed about that with regards to the Apostle Paul. Let me see if I remember them all. I can't find my note on it. Paul, Peter, John, see, Luke had one he wrote in the Gospels. But anyway, the word tithe, tithing, or tithes did not appear in any of those writings other than in a couple of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, I believe it is. And we went over one of those in Matthew where, you know, they were bragging about, oh, we tithe on every little mint and every little thing on the garden. And Jesus corrects them. He says, you've overlooked weightier matters. But they were still on the old covenant, remember? Because he does endorse it right there. He said that's okay. But then he shows it was part of the law, because he states it right in that verse, that you overlook weightier matters of the law, meaning that that was part of the law. So we don't do that based on that. And in Hebrews 7, the rest of the Bible, this New Testament, does not have those tithe, or tithing in it. You can take a concordance or whatever search program you use, and you can prove that to yourself. So I ask you, with Peter, James, Paul, John, I was surprised it wasn't in John. If they were supposed to teach the church this, so they did, because remember, a lot of them are Gentiles. They don't know anything about it, hardly. Why didn't they teach them? If tithing is such a key issue in the new covenant, why did not these early teachers teach that to their congregations?
One of the strong arguments is that Paul said that he worked for free. If he'd been teaching tithing, that would have been a very serious error.
Yeah, right.
I didn't charge you, he says to the Corinthians. Right. I did tent making in the evening. Well, that would have been terribly bad if he was not telling them to keep.
Right. Yeah, as a matter of fact, when I get into the giving part of this, I bring that out.
Yeah.
This will be a shock to most people, and that was a shock to me. Have you ever noticed when the contributions or special offerings, or what you want to call, who's it made up for? The poor. You ever notice that? Now, Paul did receive some support from a couple of congregations.
Absolutely.
And like he said, I'm leaving you this as a model example. He said, I work day and night, I labor day and night with my hands, so I not be a burden on you, so I can preach the gospel free. He did not want to burden people. It's a very hard thing to tell people, well, how'd you like to be a Christian? All you got to do is pay 3 tithes and start keeping the Sabbath and blah, 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 blah. That doesn't encourage people to want to be a Christian. That runs them off somewhere.
Yeah, we did it.
We did it. We didn't know to run.
It's interesting that one of the earliest Christian documents, the Tithing, the teaching of the apostles, actually condemns. It says that if any traveling preacher, right, he asks for money or stays longer than 3 days
I've read that.
in your house, kick them out.
You're a leech.
That's a pretty good compass of where the early Christians were with this.
Yeah, and of course, like I say, if you just take those other writings, other than Matthew and Luke, and of course Hebrews, it's not even really talking about it. It points it out. It's in the law right there in its own verse. So if we do what Paul says, where you become cursed if you don't do it all, well, if you're going to do the one tithe, you need to do all of them then. And very few people teach multiple tithing. There are still some groups that do that. But they know most of the time you can't get away with that. They might get away with 1 tithe. But you're not going to get away with preaching 3 tithes or 2 tithes. Because we know now from all of us, most of us in here, I guess, from experience, what people go through with that. And I have been on, you say, both sides of this issue, and I see what it did to people.
We visited people in England, I remember that quite clearly. A lady did not have a fire in her hearth to warm herself. And she was paying her tithe. I remember that, which meant to be imprinted in my mind forever. The other one point I think is useful in Malachi, where they use the thing about don't rob God.
Right.
What they don't read is 4:4 of Malachi.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the law of Moses. So if we can do that, you have to keep the whole law of Moses. That's obviously not instruction for us then.
Right.
It's so crooked the way they're doing that.
Yeah, it's really, you've got to separate this old and new covenant. You have got to get that straight.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you try to pick up parts of it and bring it over here. Well, I like this clean, unclean meats thing over here, and I like this tithing thing, but I don't like that, I do like that. It's a package deal. I keep saying it's a package deal. You take the old covenant or you take the new covenant. If you go the old covenant, remember, law requires penalty. Law requires penalty. We're on the law of Christ. And there will be a penalty even for that if we don't obey the words of Christ. Because he says, listen. And when he's baptized, comes up out of the water, listen to my son. Don't listen to Moses, listen to my son. And I think he says a couple other places. And he even tells us how to be careful how we listen.
Absolutely.
So,
Sorry, just since we're nearing the end, just for the record, we are not lawless, and you'll do a part 2 on this regarding the New Testament.
yeah, right, right. This is not anti-giving 100%, okay? Don't get that in your mind.
Yeah.
But because we get into the New Testament, we find out that a lot of people gave everything. I'm not saying we have to do that. Remember, they sold their property and they laid it to the feet of the apostles, and every man had as he needed. Remember when they were starving in Jerusalem and they collected this money to send to Jerusalem? So we are, as a matter of fact, there's some very strong teachings in the New Covenant about believers supporting their parents, children, and grandchildren are responsible. So there will not be a what? Because they wanted to help the widows. You've got a widowed person.
Yeah.
So it becomes a responsibility of the children and grandchildren to take care of that widow, as not to be a burden on the church, so the church can really help. As it says, true widows or whatever. So it's pretty strong teaching. And you don't hear that much. You hear about you need to give the 10%. But how about you take care of these widows in your congregation here? You take up an offering for them and distribute it out. Fourthly, we were talking about earlier, we have Social Security. And most people are not really destitute in this country. I'm sure there may be some certain cases we don't know about. But overall, we're a very blessed nation as far as our living standard. Some of these other places are horrible. I've been in some of these countries, and they're horrible places. You don't want to live there. You see them living in mud shacks, just filthy conditions. So you don't want to go down there. We want to help people, encourage people to be believers, not give all these hoops to jump through or whatever, to make it so complicated. It's a simple matter of believing the gospel of the kingdom of God, repenting of your sin, turning around, changing, and making a conscious effort to live the Christian life.
Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Yeah, Jesus said his yoke is easy, and Peter said, our forefathers couldn't bear this yoke, and we can't either. Referring back to the law of Moses.
In Acts 15, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
Acts
a very good verse to remember.
Yeah, Acts 15 is a very good chapter to read. That'll help you get straightened out.
What is it? Just give the verse out for our people here. Which verse is that in 15?
Give that verse where he talks about to the Gentiles. Can you find it real
These
quick?
Jews could not bear the Torah.
Yeah.
That's very, very difficult to
I
do.
think it's 15:9 or 15. I'm not sure. It's
Yeah.
exact.
10.
10. Okay. Quote.
15, yes.
Somebody read that.
Now therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our forefathers nor we have been able to bear?
Marvelous.
Right.
The Jews hate that verse, by the way.
Yeah, this is a good chapter, by the way, if you're
Oh, yeah.
struggling with some of this. This is what helped me more than anything. You ever read what he said, what we're going to put on the Gentiles? Not much. Now, I'm sure they were taught other things in addition to this later on, but to get them started.
Mm.
And some of that then was kind of to keep peace among the Jews and the Gentiles. You got to keep in mind, we had Jewish people with this background of law, meats, etc. We had Gentiles that ate everything. And just as a matter of loving your brother,
Mhm.
you know, it talks about in one place, is it 14, Romans 14, about causing
14,
your
14.
brother not to stumble. You know,
Mhm.
you may approve of something. Some people may say approve of drinking alcoholic beverages. But if you're dealing with someone that has a problem with that, that's between you and God.
Yeah.
It's, you know, you don't want to cause your brother to stumble. And, you know, it's the same way with there's certain groups out there that don't eat meat, period. Now,
Seventh-day Adventists, yes,
you'd like to bring them along,
of course.
but you don't want to make that the big issue.
Mhm.
So, you know, when you go out, instead of getting the big steak, you get the whatever they eat.
Small steak.
then you can communicate. Then you can communicate on the same plane. You've got to find a common point that's not objectionable to either side.
Oh, just to add to the 15th chapter there, it's interesting that, so this is Paul coming to Jerusalem with Barnabas.
Right.
And verse 5 is an interesting
Oh yeah.
detail that tells me that the Jerusalem church, the church of the apostles, were not against Torah. They were probably keeping a lot of Torah stuff still.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
Well,
so if the apostolic church, the right?
yeah. Well, remember, was it James that finally came around? I believe it was. That finally stood up and agreed. And James, from what I can
After
understand,
hearing,
after hearing all the argument.
counter argument.
Yeah,
my point
right.
is that
Because he was kind of the legalist, I understand, among the group.
Mm.
If you read his book, you know, it's kind of in that attitude. But you're right, verse 5, but certain ones of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed stood up. See, they believed.
there were Christians.
Right. They were Christians. We were Christians. We thought. Anyway, we were. But we still adhered to the law of Moses, or parts of it, put it that way. And we were placing ourselves under curse at this time. I hope you got something out of it and you're not too confused.
Did you do the giving thing first, or that's
No,
coming later?
I talked to Carlos and I had been swapping back and
This
forth.
was tithing today.
Yeah, this is
strictly.
tithing today. Next time we go into the giving part,
Yeah.
which would be what we do.
Mhm.
You covenant giving.
Good.
Thank you.
Good. Appreciate it. Okay, yeah, so where are we? We're going to sing a hymn, Sarah, or?
We sang at the beginning.
Maybe we'll just report on, we were in the Methodist church this morning,
Hold on, I tell you.
and by telling my seat.